survivors of a horrible plane crash who got themselves out of the frozen wilderness, an incredible woman who defied all odds and fought back, or stories of time spent on the ocean gone horribly wrong. These tales are crazy, they are inspiring, and all of these people are survivors. In no particular order, here are the top 10 epic survival stories that will give you chills. Starting off in our number 10 spot, we have Ada Blackjack. Ada was a woman from Alaska, and she was a part of the indigenous Inupiat people. She was hired by some Canadians for an expedition to the Wrangel Islands, which in current times is Russian territory, but back when this story took place in 1921, the expedition was intended to claim the islands in the name of Canada. Ada was hired to be the cook and the seamstress for the expedition, and she was told that she would be one of many indigenous people on the trip, but this was a lie. In the beginning, there were 5 people left on the island, including Ada, and the other 4 people were European Canadians and Americans. They first got to the island on September 16th, 1921, but quite quickly they realized that their rations were running low. 3 of the crew members left Ada alone with the other member of the crew who was ill, while the 3 went off in search of resources, and this was the last time any of them were seen. Ada was left to care for this ailing member who was sure to treat her horribly, while she essentially kept him alive. Soon the ill member passed away and Ada was now completely alone. Ada survived alone on this island for 2 years after they initially arrived. 2 years! This is unbelievable for many reasons, including the imminent risk of a polar bear attack at any point. She ended up being rescued after all of this time alone, and she used the little bit of money she had from selling the furs she collected over the 2 years to get the help needed to cure her son's tuberculosis. Ada was undoubtedly an incredible person with an unbelievable story, but it's also important to note that not only did Ada receive criticism for not keeping that one crewmate alive, but she also spent the rest of her life in poverty despite the multiple books that were written about her and the entire ordeal. I think that speaks for itself. In our number 9 spot today, we have Vesna Vulovic. On January 26, 1972, Vesna was a 22-year-old flight attendant, and she was assigned at JAT Yugoslavia Airlines Flight 367 from Stockholm to Belgrade with a stopover in Copenhagen. Apparently, the company which she worked for had actually mistaken her for another employee who shared the same name, but since she had never been to Denmark before, she just saw it as an opportunity to travel and went on the flight anyway. Less than 1 hour on the journey from Copenhagen to Belgrade, the flight exploded mid-air. The plane fell from its height of 33,000 feet and landed in a village in what today is the Czech Republic. A member of the village, Bruno Honk, went to inspect the crash site, of course not expecting to find any survivors, but he found one, Vesna. He pulled her from the wreckage and used his knowledge that he had as a World War II medic to help keep her alive until rescue came. Among the 28 people on board the plane that day, Vesna was the only survivor. Vesna suffered 3 broken vertebrae, 2 broken legs, broken ribs, and a fractured skull, and once she arrived in hospital, she was in a coma for several days. When she awoke, she had no memory of the accident at all. Doctors didn't think she would ever be able to walk again, but after just 10 months, she was able to. Apparently, she credits this to her, quote, Serbian stubbornness. Vesna's story is still one of the incredible survival stories, and it landed her the strange Guinness World Record of longest fall without a parachute, which I don't think is a title she is too keen on holding. There are a number of reasons why people believe she escaped her certain death. Some believe her position in the rear of the plane with the food cart prevented her from being sucked into the air when the plane broke apart. The plane's impact was also softened by the trees and snow, but hey, I think the woman survived a plane crash. Whatever the reasons or whatever led to that, it's all incredible and we should just focus on that. Vesna has been quoted as saying, "Everyone thinks I am lucky, but they are mistaken. If I were lucky, I would have never had this accident." In our number 8 spot today, we have Beck Weathers. In the spring of 1996, American pathologist Beck Weathers headed out on an expedition to summit Mount Everest as a part of an 8-member crew that was led by veteran mountaineer Rob Hall. As the group got further and further up the mountain, Beck began to realize that due to an eye surgery he had previously had, he wasn't able to see very well in the harsh climate, and once it got dark out, his visibility was frighteningly low. Because of these vision troubles, when the group got near to the summit, Rob, the leader, told Beck to stay on the side of the trail while he took the rest of the group to the top, and he assured him that they would come to get him on the way back down. Beck didn't really want to do this, but he agreed. He waited and saw other groups pass him on their way down, and some others even offered to take him, but he stayed and waited for Rob. Fortunately, Rob would never come back. Once the group had reached the summit, one of the climbers was too weak to continue on, and Rob refused to leave his side. One of the group members who did descend ended up passing Beck, which is how he got this information, and Beck decided to wait for another member of the team who was on their way way down, Mike Groom, because he was Rob's fellow team leader. Once Beck was with Mike and the other climbers, they began making their way down, but of course there was a blizzard brewing. The storm left Beck and the other climbers quite disoriented, and they couldn't find Camp 4, which was the camp closest to the summit. When the storm broke, Beck and 4 other climbers were so weak that they were left alone so that those who were stronger could go in search of help. Another guide from another group came to rescue several of the climbers, but at this point Beck wasn't there anymore. This is because he had previously lost one of his gloves, and he began to really feel the effects of the high altitudes and absolutely freezing temperatures, which led to a sort of delirium. He apparently jumped to his feet, yelled out, "I've got this all figured out," and then was subsequently thrown from his feet, toppling over other climbers by gale force winds. The other climbers were sure he had died, but he didn't. Instead, he was spending the night in a bivouac in a blizzard with his hands and face exposed to the elements. When he woke up, he figured that he had been left for dead, and he started to think, if I don't get up right now, then this is all going to be over very quickly. His sheer willpower managed to get him up, and he hiked all the way back down to Camp 4 on his own. His fellow climbers were shocked to see him, and they still didn't believe he was going to live, so they thought they might as well just make him comfortable. In a tent alone, Beck made it through another freezing night in utter agony thanks to his frozen face and hands. The next day, the other climbers were again shocked to see him still alive and coherent. Finally, they helped him walk on his frozen feet to a camp lower down, where one of the highest altitude medical evacuations performed by a helicopter was done. In the end, 4 of the people in Beck's original group passed away, but Beck escaped with his life. Following the rescue, Beck had his right arm amputated halfway between the elbow and wrist. All 4 fingers and his thumb on his left hand were amputated, as well as parts of both of his feet. His nose was amputated and reconstructed with tissue from his ear and forehead. In our number 7 spot today, we have the Miracle of the Andes. This is perhaps one of the most famous survival stories of all time, and it starts in October of 1972 when members of the Old Christians rugby team, along with members of their families and their friends, were flying to a match in Chile. The pilot made a mistake and began to descend while in the Andes, and this led to the plane striking a mountain, which sheared both of its wings off, and the plane then crashed into a remote area that has been nicknamed the Valley of Tears. The initial crash took the lives of 12 people, which left 33 survivors. A search party was initiated, but after 8 days it was called off because the conditions on the mountains were considered near unsurvivable, and because the remnants of the white aircraft would basically be invisible in the snow. In order to survive, the remaining people who were stuck here had to resort to the most extreme survival methods in order to sustain themselves, which involved using those who had passed away for sustenance. In the coming weeks, 6 more people passed away, and then an avalanche took the lives of 8 more. It is now December, remember this flight happened in October, and 2 of the remaining survivors set out to find help and miraculously found 3 Chilean men 4 days later. By December 23rd, all 16 of the remaining survivors were rescued after being stranded for over 2 months with no food, no gear, literally nothing. In our number 6 spot today, we have Angela Hernandez. This story starts off in July of 2018 when a woman named Angela Hernandez was driving down Highway 1 near Big Sur on her way to Southern California. While driving, a small animal ran out into the middle of the road, and of course, for a multitude of reasons, Angela didn't want to hit it, so she swerved. Unfortunately, this led to Angela shooting right off the edge of a cliff in her SUV, which then tumbled down about 200 feet to a grim area of the rocky beach. I call it grim because it's an area where no one visits. Of course, this entire scenario is exceptionally traumatic and severe, and it left Angela with very serious injuries. After the crash, she was suffering from a brain hemorrhage, fractured ribs, a broken collarbone, ruptured blood vessels in both of her eyes, and a collapsed lung, but despite all of these injuries, the most important thing was that she didn't die, and she wasn't about to let her fate be sealed right there. She was initially unconscious after the crash, but when she came to, she saw water lapping over her knees. She had a multi-tool in her car that she was able to use to break out the window so that she could crawl out, where she then swam to the beach and passed out again. Later, when she woke up, she realized she had no shoes, and the severity of her injuries started to set in, but despite all of this, she got up and started walking. She used a hose from her car to help collect water from the dripping moss along the shore, and every time a car passed by, she tried to get their attention, but unfortunately, because of where she was, no one could see her or hear her. 7 days after the crash, some hikers were out and about searching the beach for fishing spots when they came across the wreck of the Jeep. Thankfully, these people didn't stop there and continued searching for the person who belonged to the Jeep. That is when they found Angela sleeping on some rocks. They gave her water and called for help, and finally, after 7 days, she was able to be rescued from this absolute nightmare situation. In our number 5 spot today, we have Alison Alison Botha. Sometimes I hear a story that I truly cannot believe is real, and Alison's story is absolutely one of them. She is a woman unlike any other, and this survival story starts out in her home in South Africa in December of 1994. She was 27 years old at the time, and after a night out with friends, she drove back to her apartment, and when she parked her car, a man with a knife ended up forcing his way inside. This man forced her over into another seat, and he began to drive her car with her inside to go and pick up some sort of accomplice. These two absolute monsters, who really don't even deserve to be named, took Alison to a deserted area on the outskirts of town and did some of the most violent and disgusting things I've ever heard that I absolutely cannot repeat here on YouTube, and then they just simply left her there for dead. At this moment, Alison was still breathing despite having been disemboweled, and I'm not even making this up, despite being nearly decapitated, and not only was she still alive after these injuries, but she also said, "I realized my life was too valuable to let go of, and that gave me the courage to survive." This is when Alison not only wrote the names she knew her attackers by in the dirt, with "I love mom" below just in case she didn't survive, but she also saw headlights in the distance and she knew this was her chance. She started to pull herself up, and this is when she realized how injured she was. I kid you not, Alison held her intestines in with one of her hands, and she used her other hand to hold her head onto her body, and she made her way towards the headlights. Thankfully, a young veterinary student was on the road that night, and he saw Alison and stopped to help her. He used his vet knowledge to help keep her alive until emergency services arrived. Not only did Alison survive, but she also remembered so much about her attackers that she was able to lead the police right to them, and those two are spending the rest of their lives in prison, while Alison uses her voice and her experience to empower and motivate others around the world. In our number 4 spot today, we have the Apollo 13 crew. Many of us have heard this story before because it truly is unbelievable, but also because of the Tom Hanks classic. And no, I'm not talking about Toy Story 2. This space crew took flight on April 11th, 1970 and had the intention of landing on the moon, but because of an oxygen tank explosion on board that nearly killed all of them, these astronauts were forced to go the furthest out in space any living human has ever been in order to save their lives. They used the lunar module as a lifeboat, and they stretched their rations that were intended to be a day and a half worth of food for 2 people into food that lasted for 4 days among 3 people. They faced hardships some of us can't even imagine, while those on the ground worked tirelessly to figure out how to get them home safely. Basically, in the end, the crew had to make an orbital correction that took them far from the moon, about 248,655 miles from Earth, before they could slingshot back around towards Earth. The lunar module was their safe space while still out in space, but re-entry to Earth is a totally different ballgame. This meant that they had to get back into the damaged command module for this part before they were able to land back on Earth, and they did so safely. Everyone involved in this entire mission, from the crew in space to those on the ground working to save them, did incredible work, and it really is a story that will never be forgotten. In our number 3 spot today, we have Jose Salvador Alvarenga. On November 17th, 2012, Jose set out on a professional fishing trip with a young fisherman named Ezekiel Cordoba. They planned the trip to take around 30 hours, and they were setting out to hunt tuna, mahi-mahi, and sharks. Just a few short hours into their trip, however, things went awry when a storm struck that lasted 5 days, and it of course blew them way off course. Jose of course radioed in to his boss to call for help, but unfortunately the radio had been totally disabled by the storm, as well as the rest of the boat's electronics, and the motor was badly damaged. When the men didn't return, a search party was sent out, but it only lasted 2 days before being called off because they just assumed the men had already passed away. The 2 men survived by eating raw fish, turtles, and jellyfish, and they drank rainwater and turtle blood, but the weeks quickly turned to months and there was still no sign of rescue. This is when the young fisherman fell ill from the raw food diet and he sadly passed away. Jose was now on his own, and he managed to survive another 9 months alone at sea until he finally spotted a small island. He abandoned the boat and swam all the way to shore, and he had reached the Marshall Islands and met a local couple who immediately alerted the authorities. He survived out there for 438 days, and it is estimated that he covered somewhere between 5,500 to 6,700 miles. In our number 2 spot today, we have Mauro Prosperi. Mauro is an Italian police officer who got lost in the Sahara Desert in 1994 while doing the Marathon of the Sands in Morocco. This marathon is a 6-day-long endurance race in one of the most dry and barren places in the world. During the race, a sandstorm hit and caused Mauro to become disoriented, and he lost his way. One day after going missing, he found an abandoned Muslim shrine in Algeria, and he used it as shelter from the sun. He killed and ate bats to survive, and for hydration he had to drink his own urine. He licked dew off of the rocks, and he sucked moisture out of the wet wipes that he had with him. After failing to be seen and rescued by 2 different different aircrafts that flew right over him, he figured he would never be found and he tried to take his own life. The heat in the desert, however, is so dry that the wounds clotted and he thankfully survived this attempt. For 9 days he walked through the desert and ate insects and reptiles. Finally he found a small group of nomadic people and they took him to the nearest village. From there he was flown to a hospital where doctors said his liver had almost completely failed. Having traveled 180 miles in all, Prosperi lost 35 pounds in body weight and it took years for him to recover fully, but despite all of this he has remained an enthusiastic runner and even returned and completed the same race a few times since. In our number 1 spot today we have Tami Ashcraft. In September of 1983, Tami and her fiance Richard Sharp set out on a 4,000-mile journey across the Pacific Ocean in order to help a friend deliver a 44-foot yacht from Tahiti to San Diego. This was much longer than the pair had ever sailed before, but they felt due to their experience and having each other that they would be able to do it. So I mentioned they set sail in September, and by October a Category 4 hurricane blew them way off course. The pair tried to ride out the storm that was kicking up 40-foot waves and 140-mile-per-hour winds, you know, hurricane stuff. And when Richard told Tami to head below deck, right after she heard him scream, and before she could help, she was thrown against a cabin wall and knocked unconscious. When she awoke the next day, she found the yacht mostly destroyed and Richard was nowhere to be found. She found his safety harness dangling over the end of the boat, which caused her to realize that he had been thrown overboard. The cabin was filling with water, the masts were broken, the sails were dragging in the sea, and both the navigational system and engine were not in very good condition. Despite her injuries and her loss, Tami kicked into survival mode. She used a broken pole and storm jib to create a makeshift sail, and she began pumping water out of the cabin. She found a sextant and a watch which helped her navigate towards the closest landmass, which was 1,500 miles away. In total, she spent 41 days adrift at sea and survived by eating canned fruit salad and sardines. In the end, she was saved by a Japanese research ship that had noticed the drifting yacht near the coast of the island. Alright guys, that has been our list for today. Thanks so much for checking it out. I've been your host today, Olivia Kozlowski, and I will see you again soon. Bye!